In this video, we will be reviewing a hand played between Alex Foxen and Michael Soiza at the 25k Euro Triton High Roller Series event in London. Speaking of Michael Soiza, as a quick aside, I want to let him, as well as everyone else that has inquired about potential business or coaching opportunities, that I'm planning to launch something within the next month or so. So apologies for not getting back to you, but I just have been crazy busy and I want to get to market before doing anything else.
Soiza now continues the action. You got to stack up to almost 40 bigs. So must be very happy with that. Soiza plays all the massive events like we've been saying today. Not so lucky here though. Really nice spot for Soiza to bet as well.
Michael opens in the hijack with ace-6 of hearts, and Alex calls in the big blind with jack-4 of clubs, both of which are standard plays with the ante. The flop comes king 4-4, Alex checks, and Michael continues with a quarter pot bet. Despite the fact that Alex will have more trips in his range given this flop, this isn't enough to overcome the big blind's overall range disadvantage, which justifies Michael's bet with the ace high and backdoor flush draw. Michael will still have a significant advantage when it comes to top pairs and overpairs, and the big blind's range is generally overall weak due to its width. Additionally, all things being equal, paired boards tend to cause the preflop raiser to retain a significant portion of its range advantage, since they reduce the potential number of pairs and straight combos that the preflop caller may have. Of course, the rank of the pair matters, which is why we don't see the hijack betting with even greater frequency on this board. If we rerun the sim with a flop where the king is paired instead of the 4, Pio will bet nearly 100% of its range in the hijack shoes. However, since paired boards tend to be dry, Pio will often ratchet down the bet sizing because there are fewer hands in the opponent's range that will be able to withstand a larger bet. As we can see, if we replace one of the paired 4s with a 3, Pio would start betting larger with greater frequency, as this board introduces a number of additional pairs and draws in the big blind's range.
Foxen is going to have quite a bit of 4s, which his hand actually proves. You know, Soiza would never open jack 4 from that position, but Foxen has all those kind of hands with 4s in it. Which makes this a pretty dicey spot against tough opponents on boards like this, because they're aware of that. He's going to check raise.
Alex check raises 3x, and we see that Pio is doing quite a bit of check raising on this board in the big blind's shoes. Obviously, this is primarily due to the paired 4, since the big blind has significantly more 4s in its range. As we can see, if we rerun the sim with a board that is not paired but still contains 2 low cards, Pio dampens the aggression and only check raises 25% of the time. We should note, however, that the increased percentage of raising on the board is not solely due to the increased number of trip 4s that are raising. To maintain balance, Pio also adds more bluffs in its range. From a conceptual standpoint, we can think of nuttish holdings in our range like the rising tide that lifts all boats. And this is why it is important, as a first step in any analysis, to think about how our entire range interacts with the board, because that will often have a significant influence on how we play our individual holdings.
These are always the times where if your opponent folds, it kind of feels like you wasted your trips, but more often than not, you're going to get called because people don't really believe you, because the board is so dry, right? I mean, are you even going to check raise all your kings here? And Michael Soiza proves that point. He's going to make the call with the ace high, not convinced yet that he has the worst of it.
Soiza calls, and I think many players would be folding here, but we see that this is the correct play from the GTO perspective. Perhaps against the general population that doesn't check raise enough, folding would be okay, but against a higher level opponent that balances its bluff and value, holding an ace with a backdoor flush draw is a clear call.
And that's trouble. There's two things in Foxen's head now. He can be very happy with the ace, because of course he's going to get called by ace highs a lot, but it is harder to get paid off by either a king or a hand like pocket nines, pocket tens that's stuck around. But it's typically one of those situations we'll figure out after the hand if it was a bad card or not, and in this case it definitely isn't.
The turn brings the ace of spades and Foxen checks. This is an interesting play, and we see that Pio prefers to continue. The solver is barreling with this holding to extract max value since the board is generally favorable to the hijack opener. Not only should he have a number of aces and kings in his range, this turn card also opens up a few draw combos as well that should call an additional bet. On the other hand, if the turn was a 10 of spades, we see that Pio would check with much greater frequency even with trips. And although we should generally allocate a certain portion of our nuttish holdings to our checking range, there are better hands to do that with in this spot, such as quads or these full houses that both need less protection and block a number of the opponent's continues. So it appears that this check is more of an exploitative play by Foxen, where he is essentially saying that he has a king or pure air.
This is pretty cool. Because there's so many ace highs in Soiza's hand range there, I think Foxen is saying here, listen, if I was bluffing, if I had some 5-6 of hearts kind of hand, then I'd be giving up a lot on the ace because the chance that I'm going to get called is just too high. And that's what we always talk about. These small fields, it's really important to have a sound overall strategy, not just the hand in a vacuum where you look at this hand and think, how do I play this the best now? No, like what Foxen is thinking here is, if I play this hand against Soiza 100 times, what is the best way to play this hand with all these different hands that I could have here? And that's very important. You know, you can definitely deviate from that. Some players you'll play more with than others. Some situations are a little bit specific, but I think that especially when cards up is enabled, that's extra important.
Michael decides to try to reclaim the initiative and makes a modest 33% pot bet. As we can see, Pio is mostly checking behind with this weak ace and is generally only betting aces with a stronger kicker. However, the EVs are close between checking and betting small, so either play should generally be fine from a GTO perspective.
227.
He's going to check raise again. He's going for the triple check raise achievement, perhaps. But you really hate to be Soiza on this spot. I mean, these are the kind of situations where good players just end up having such weak hands a lot of the time. Anything that connects well with a king here, and by connecting well I mean like, even if Soiza had queen jack of clubs, he would bet call this flop, for instance, because there's so many turns he can continue on, thinking that his opponent is going to bet a lot. So now that he has an ace,
So Foxen pulls off the double check raise and Michael calls, both of which are consistent with the solver strategy. And this highlights one of the downsides to betting the weak ace on the turn instead of closing the action in position. Because although this is a clear call for Michael from a GTO perspective, given the bluffs Alex should have in his range, from a human perspective, this spot is quite gross.
it's so hard to get away from it. Especially because you can rule out a king. You can rule out a king, that makes it look a little bit stronger, but you know, Foxen is aware of the fact that he can have any 4 there is, all the way down to, you know, 4-3, 4-5. I mean, 5-4 offsuits is definitely in the range of hands that he would play from the big blind.
All in.
The river bricks and Alex shoves, which is not surprising given his holding. However, interestingly, Pio is also shoving with every remaining ace in its range, and the equities and EVs between strong and weak aces are close, but actually decrease in value with stronger kickers. Further, there is a pretty significant drop-off in EV between checking and betting small, and then an EV bump when shoving, which is more typically a pattern you see with bluffing hands that either want to give up or bet large. So is Pio playing these aces as value bets or bluffs? Well, that's probably the wrong question to ask since the solver doesn't think in those terms. It appears that this may simply be a product of the solver's steadfast adherence to balance. Since there are a number of fours in the big blind's range that want to bet for value here, the solver will search for other holdings in its range to also take the same line to avoid playing face up. Typically, these decoy lines will be allocated to bluffs. However, in this case, we see that Pio is not betting with any of its air. Instead, it's giving up with 100% of these combos, possibly because of their blocking properties to the opponent's missed draws. Although not typical, Pio will sometimes create balance by taking pseudo-bluffing lines with holdings that have some marginal value, as is the case here with the aces and a few King X combos. We see that if the game had played out the exact same way on an unpaired board, the big blind would not shove all of its aces, presumably since the big blind would have fewer nuttish hands in its range.
And this is just one of those sickening spots that you get into. Big blinds behind for Soiza. I think that might have been his last time bank chip. If you're up against a bad player, this is a much easier decision, but a good player can put so much pressure and try to take advantage of you. Oh, great fold. That is a really good fold for Michael Soiza.
And after a long tank, Michael makes the correct laydown, likely because he recognized that Alex should have very limited bluffs in this spot. Although Pio is mostly calling here, we see that only a small amount of EV is gained by calling, and all of the aces are essentially being played the same as bluff catchers with one exception. Oddly, Pio is randomly folding most of his ace-jack holdings, but I wouldn't read too much into this as the EVs across all the aces are relatively close. Sometimes you will see these type of aberrations that appear to have little to no relationship to blockers or unblockers. I personally would advise against going down a rabbit hole to try to understand the reasoning for this strategy, which may just be due to a solver defect, or not solving all the way to the equilibrium, or some incomprehensible metagame that Pio is playing against itself. It generally will be a much better use of your time to analyze strategies in situations where the EV difference between options is relatively larger. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.